The dawn broke over the Willamette Valley in shades of amber and rose, painting the sky with the kind of beauty that only early risers witnessed. Sarah Mitchell stood on the tarmac of Salem Regional Airport, her weathered hands gripping a thermos of black coffee, while her eyes traced every detail of the Cessna 172 that would carry her fate. The airplane had been her second home for the past decade, a modest single-engine bird painted in faded blue and white, with scratch marks along the fuselage that told stories of countless journeys. She'd named her Pathfinder, and today, the name felt more meaningful than ever. At 42 years old, Sarah carried the kind of quiet resolve that came from having her life redirected by catastrophe. 5 years ago, her younger sister had been swept away in unexpected flash floods during a hiking trip in Arizona. They'd found her body 3 days later, just 8 miles from a rescue team that had been searching in the wrong coordinates. That single tragedy had become Sarah's singular obsession, not with blame or revenge, but with prevention and salvation. If she could save even one family from experiencing what hers had endured, every ounce of effort would be worth it. The past 8 months had been a whirlwind of planning, research, and sacrifice. Sarah had liquidated her investment portfolio, borrowed against her home, and called in every favor from her network of engineers and disaster relief specialists. The equipment now secured in the Cessna's cargo hold represented $250,000 in cutting-edge thermal imaging technology and sensor arrays. Each device was designed for one purpose: detecting human heat signatures beneath water, in rubble, in the darkness where rescue teams groped blindly for survivors. She walked around the aircraft now, performing her pre-flight check with meticulous attention. The rudder looked solid. The ailerons responded smoothly. The tires had proper pressure. Every rivet, every wire, every seal would need to perform flawlessly today because there was no room for failure, not with so many lives depending on her reaching her destination. Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a text from her daughters, twins Emma and Sophie, now 17 years old and far too aware of their mother's reckless determination. "Mom, you better come back safe. We love you." The message came with an emoji of a tiny airplane and a heart. She smiled through sudden moisture in her eyes. They'd grown up watching their mother channel grief into action, and while she knew they worried, they also understood the weight of her mission. "Love you both," she typed back. "I'll call from the air. This is for Aunt Lisa." The girls would never know their aunt. Lisa had been gone since before they were born, but Sarah had made sure they understood her story. That their mother's obsession with saving strangers was actually a love letter to a sister they'd never meet. In some ways, Sarah felt that Lisa was flying with her today, that her sister's spirit inhabited the very air currents that would carry the Cessna northeast toward the disaster zones. The weather briefing had been positive. A high-pressure system was moving through, clear skies predicted through the afternoon, and minimal wind shear. Sarah had filed her flight plan just after midnight, giving herself every advantage. The route would take her across Oregon, into Idaho, then down toward the Nevada-Utah border where 3 consecutive weeks of unseasonable storms had transformed normally dry riverbeds into raging torrents. Entire communities were cut off. Modern rescue operations relied on highway access that no longer existed and satellite imagery that couldn't penetrate cloud cover. But Sarah's thermal sensors could. They were designed to work in conditions where conventional rescue methodology failed. She climbed into the cockpit, settling into the familiar leather seat that had molded itself to her frame over years of flights. The control stick felt like an extension of her arm. The instrument panel, a mix of ancient analog gauges and newer digital displays, represented the marriage of old aviation and new technology. She ran through the startup sequence with the automaticity of ritual: magnetos, fuel pump, throttle, primer. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught with a rumbling roar that she felt in her chest. Salem Tower, Pathfinder 729er requesting pushback. She spoke into her headset, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Pathfinder 729er cleared for pushback. Winds from the north at 6 knots, came the reply. As the tug connected to her nose gear, Sarah glanced down at the photograph taped to her instrument panel. It was of Lisa, smiling at the rim of the Grand Canyon, arms spread wide as if she could embrace the entire landscape. Lisa had loved the outdoors, had been adventurous to the point of recklessness, had lived every moment as though it might be her last. In a cruel twist of fate, that philosophy had been prescient. The pushback process felt automatic. Sarah had done it hundreds of times. But today, each movement felt sacred, ceremonial. She was not just a pilot executing a flight plan. She was a woman carrying the weight of grief, the hope of strangers, and the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose because she'd already lost everything that mattered. The taxiway stretched before her, and Sarah guided the Cessna toward the runway with gentle pressure on the rudder pedals. Other aircraft were already in the air, commercial jets and smaller aircraft conducting their normal business. None of them knew that this little blue and white bird carried something extraordinary. None of them understood that in a few hours, this flight would either change the course of many lives or become a cautionary tale about ambition exceeding wisdom. Pathfinder 729er cleared for takeoff, runway 16 left, the tower authorized. Sarah pushed the throttle forward and the engine's roar deepened. The runway began to blur beneath her wheels. The airspeed indicator climbed, 30 knots, 40, 50. The nose lifted with that magical sensation of release, and suddenly the earth fell away. The Cessna's wheels left the pavement, and Sarah felt that timeless moment of weightlessness that never got old, no matter how many hours she'd logged. Below her, Salem disappeared. The Willamette Valley spread out like a quilt of green and brown. Somewhere up there, in the thin air above the earth, Sarah felt connected to her sister, to the 17 strangers who didn't yet know that hope was flying toward them, to the engineers whose technology now hummed with potential in her cargo hold. She set her course and climbed higher, the Cessna's small engine working faithfully against gravity. The morning sun glinted off her windscreen. The world looked innocent and perfect from 5,000 feet. She had no idea that in less than an hour, everything would change, that military jets would be scrambled, that protocols would be questioned, that her quiet act of courage would become national news. For now, she was simply Sarah Mitchell, a woman on a mission, flying toward destiny with nothing but faith and determination as her guides. The coordinates of the disaster zones grew closer with every passing minute, drawing her inexorably toward a moment that would test not just her flying skills, but the very boundaries of what was possible when one person refused to accept the limits that others had placed on her. The Cessna climbed steadily through the morning air. Sarah's hands relaxed on the control stick as the altimeter needle crept past 6,000 feet. Below her, the patchwork landscape of central Oregon unfolded in geometric precision, forests giving way to open rangeland, highways cutting through wilderness like silver threads. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the last wisps of morning haze, and Sarah felt a profound sense of rightness. Everything was going according to plan. The weather remained clear, her fuel consumption was nominal, and she was making excellent time toward the first waypoint. She'd been airborne for exactly 39 minutes and 14 seconds when she noticed it. The radio crackled, not with the usual chatter of air traffic control, but with a strange electronic stutter. Sarah frowned and adjusted the frequency dial, cycling back to the standard VFR communication channel. Nothing but hiss. She tapped the radio's face with her index finger, an old pilot's gesture that rarely accomplished anything but felt necessary. The hiss intensified, then seemed to almost resolve into words before dissolving back into white noise. "That's weird," Sarah muttered, her voice barely audible beneath the Cessna's engine noise. She wasn't alarmed yet. Radios occasionally glitched, usually due to interference from power lines or atmospheric conditions. She cycled the radio off, waited 10 seconds, and switched it back on. The usual welcome hum of the communication system sounded, and Sarah pressed the transmit button. Salem approach, Pathfinder 729er, level at 6,500, heading 030, she transmitted, providing her standard position report. The response should have come immediately. Instead, there was only static, thick, impenetrable static that seemed to swallow her words like a void. Sarah's pulse quickened slightly. She tried again, more carefully. Salem approach, do you copy? Pathfinder 729er requesting position confirmation. Still nothing. She glanced at the radio with irritation that was beginning to shade toward concern. The battery indicator showed full charge. The frequency selector clearly displayed 120.5, the correct approach frequency. She tried alternate channels, 121.5, the universal emergency frequency, 122.775, the regional flight coordination center. Every channel returned the same ominous silence. For the first time since takeoff, a cold finger of doubt traced down Sarah's spine. She forced herself to breathe deeply, calling upon the training that had been drilled into her during flight school. In an emergency, fly the aircraft first, then troubleshoot. The Cessna was flying perfectly. The engines purred with mechanical contentment. Her instruments all read nominal. So this was a communication problem, not a flight problem. Solvable, manageable. Sarah reached beneath the right side of her instrument panel where the backup communication system was installed. A newer VHF radio she'd installed 3 years ago specifically for situations like this. Her fingers found the power switch and toggled it. The indicator light glowed red, then amber, then should have turned green. Instead, it flickered once and went dark. Dead. Completely dead. No, 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 Sarah whispered, her hands moving to check connections. The antenna looked secure. The battery leads were connected. The circuit breaker hadn't popped. Everything appeared in order, yet the radio remained inert. A useless black box of silicon and circuitry that had decided today was the day to fail catastrophically. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, her flight training automatically activating contingency protocols. Visual flight was possible without radio communication. Pilots had flown for decades with nothing but landmarks and dead reckoning. She could follow her planned route, arrive at her destination, and file a report about the radio malfunction once she landed. Sure, it was irregular. Yes, it would mean operating in controlled airspace without two-way communication. But it wasn't a safety emergency, not yet. What Sarah didn't realize was that her problems had multiplied. 300 miles away, Portland Air Traffic Control Center. Tom Chen had been an air traffic controller for 23 years. He'd guided thousands of aircraft safely through Oregon airspace. He could interpret the radar blips like a poet reading verse, each one a story of altitude, speed, and heading. He knew the patterns, understood the rhythms, could predict with reasonable accuracy where any given aircraft should be at any given moment. Which was why the disappearance of Pathfinder 729er bothered him so profoundly. He'd been tracking the little Cessna since its takeoff from Salem, a routine flight plan for a cross-country journey with some kind of disaster relief equipment aboard. The pilot had been professional in her communications, her position reports timely and accurate. Then, at exactly 7:47 a.m., her radar blip had stuttered, dimmed, and vanished from his screen like a ghost. Tom leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as they scanned the radar display. Sometimes aircraft passed through zones of radar coverage where the signal degraded. Sometimes transponders experienced temporary glitches. Usually, the target returned within moments, reappearing on screen as if nothing had happened. Pathfinder 729er did not reappear. Tom's finger hovered over his communication panel. He opened a channel to Salem Regional. Salem approach, Portland Center. Did you lose Pathfinder 729er on your scope? The response came back tense. Affirmative, Center. We lost both radar and radio contact approximately 2 minutes ago. We've been trying to reach her on all frequencies with no response. The words hit Tom like a physical force. Radio and radar contact lost simultaneously was not a coincidence. It was a condition, a serious one. He immediately began logging the incident while simultaneously opening an emergency communications line to the Federal Aviation Administration. An aircraft in controlled airspace, failing to respond to radio calls, with a transponder that had gone dark. This was exactly the kind of scenario that activated emergency protocols. Within 60 seconds, the FAA was notified. Within 2 minutes, military liaison channels were activated. Within 5 minutes, a preliminary alert had been issued to Joint Base Lewis McChord that an unidentified aircraft was operating in the vicinity of restricted military airspace without proper communication. Joint Base Lewis McChord Military Operations. Colonel James Richardson sat in the ops center, calmly sipping his third coffee of the morning, when his deputy rushed in with a printed alert. The text was clinical and precise. Possible unidentified aircraft in military airspace. No radio contact, no transponder signal. Last known position coordinates. Richardson read the information with the careful attention of someone who understood that his response could have international consequences. "How long has it been dark?" he asked, his voice calm but his mind already cycling through protocols. 7 minutes, sir. The civilian controllers lost it suddenly, both communications and radar. Deliberate action or mechanical failure. Unknown at this time. Richardson made a decision. "I want F-16 scrambled, full intercept protocol, rules of engagement, neutral until visual contact and assessment complete. I want to know what we're dealing with, and I want to know in the next 30 minutes. The alarm klaxon began to sound. A sound that sent trained pilots running toward their aircraft, that activated security protocols, that turned a quiet morning into something tense and dangerous. Nobody in the Military Operations Center knew they were about to intercept an everyday hero. Nobody understood that the aircraft they were scrambling to intercept carried a woman who would rather die than abandon her mission. Nobody realized that the next hour would test not just military readiness, but the very foundations of what honor meant when duty and compassion collided. In the sky above Oregon, Sarah Mitchell continued flying forward, completely unaware that the world was about to come looking for her with missiles and guns and the weight of national security behind it all. Captain Derek "Ghost" Morrison was in the pilot's lounge at Joint Base Lewis McChord, sitting cross-legged on a worn leather couch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, when the world changed. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. His mind was drifting between the training sortie he'd just completed and the evening plans he had to grab dinner with his girlfriend, Amanda. The base was humming with its usual controlled chaos. Jets screaming overhead, ground crews moving between hangars, the constant mechanical symphony of military aviation. Then the klaxon sounded. It wasn't the routine alert that occasionally tested the base's emergency systems. It was the urgent, pulsing shriek of a scramble order, the sound that meant someone somewhere had determined that armed military intervention was immediately necessary. Derek's coffee cup hit the end table before his mind had fully registered what his body was already doing, moving. Years of training had hardwired the response into his neural pathways. Klaxon equals run. Run equals life or death. Scramble order. All available pilots to the ready room. The announcement blared through the base's public address system, redundant but necessary. Derek sprinted toward the pilot briefing room, his flight suit already clinging to his skin with adrenaline-induced sweat. Around him, other pilots were moving with the same urgent grace, a coordinated dance of military precision that had been rehearsed thousands of times. This was real. This was live. This was the moment that separated peacetime pilots from warriors. The ready room was already filling when Derek burst through the doors. His wingman, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, was right behind him, their synchronized partnership evident even in the way they moved. They'd flown together for 3 years, had logged over 800 hours in formation, had practiced emergency procedures until they could execute them blindfolded. If Derek had to trust his life to another pilot, Marcus was the only choice. Major Patricia Iron Donaldson stood at the front of the room, her face carved from stone and her eyes burning with the intensity of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. She was the squadron commander, a pilot with 18 years of experience and a reputation for making decisions that saved lives rather than risked them. "Listen up," Donaldson's voice cut through the murmur of pilots. "We have an unidentified aircraft in restricted military airspace. Lost all communication and radar contact 42 minutes ago. Last known position approximately 80 miles northwest of here, heading in a southeasterly direction toward the Cascade Range." A map materialized on the briefing room screen, a topographic display showing the last known coordinates of the mystery aircraft. Derek's trained eye immediately recognized the implications. The aircraft was flying through terrain that offered 100 places to hide, 1,000 valleys where radar became ineffective. Whatever this was, it was deliberate. "What's the threat assessment?" Derek asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding through his system. Donaldson's jaw tightened. "Unknown. We have to assume hostile intent until proven otherwise. Your mission is straightforward. Locate the aircraft, establish visual contact, attempt radio communication on all civilian frequencies, and prevent any approach towards sensitive installations. Rules of engagement are neutral until threat assessment is complete, but be prepared for escalation." The words hung in the air like a weight. Prevent approach. Be prepared for escalation. The careful military language that meant they might have to shoot down an aircraft with unknown composition and unknown crew. "What are we looking for?" Marcus asked, his pencil already moving across his briefing pad, documenting every detail. "Single-engine Cessna 172. Blue and white fuselage, civil registration number 729er. It's a light aircraft. No threat from an ordnance perspective, but we have to consider that it could be remotely piloted, loaded with explosives, or being flown under duress. Treat it with extreme caution." A Cessna 172. Derek's mind cycled through the data. Small, slow, fragile. Not a military threat in any conventional sense. But the fact that it was operating with both radio and transponder dark in restricted military airspace created an equation that added up to danger. The flight line. 10 minutes later, Derek and Marcus were running across the flight line toward the F-16 shelters. The aircraft sat like predators at rest, their sleek lines and nose cones suggesting lethal capability. Derek's F-16, nicknamed Shadow for the way it seemed to disappear at certain angles, was already being prepped by ground crew. Maintenance technicians swarmed over both jets, performing the rapid turnaround procedures that would have them ready for launch in minutes rather than hours. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Thompson, met Derek at the ladder leading up to the cockpit. "She's hot and ready, sir. All systems green. Fuel at full load, ammunition loaded per protocol." Ammunition. The word landed heavily. Missiles and cannon rounds designed to destroy aircraft. Derek tried not to think about who might be flying the Cessna, why they might be there, what circumstances had led to this moment. "Thank you, Sergeant," Derek said, his professionalism steady even as his mind raced through worst-case scenarios. The climb into the F-16 cockpit was automatic, a series of steps, grips, and positioning that Derek had performed hundreds of times. The seat enfolded him like a combination of comfort and constraint, the restraint harness securing him into position. Around him, the instruments glowed with readiness. In the cockpit of the aircraft beside him, Marcus was going through the same process. Derek ran through his startup sequence with mechanical precision. Throttle to the start position, flipping switches, the engine coughing to life with a sound like a dragon waking. The instrument panel came alive with data, altitude, heading, airspeed, fuel capacity, weapons status. Every gauge read green. Everything was ready. everything except Derek's conscience. He'd trained for this moment for his entire military career, the scenario where an unknown aircraft posed a potential threat to national security. He'd run simulations where he'd intercept targets, where he'd been forced to make split-second decisions about lethal force. But this was different. The adrenaline was real. The aircraft was real. The potential for tragedy was terrifyingly, inescapably real. "Shadow lead to Shadow 2, you ready?" Marcus's voice came through the headset, steady and professional. "Shadow 2, ready," Derek responded, his hands moving through the final checks. The tower clearance came through moments later. "Shadow flight, you are cleared for immediate launch, runway 30 left. Current winds from the northwest at 8 knots. You are weapons hot. Repeat, you are weapons hot." Derek pushed the throttle forward and the F-16's engine roared in response. Beside him, Marcus did the same. The afterburners ignited, twin pillars of flame that would carry them into the sky at supersonic speeds. The runway began to blur beneath him as the acceleration pressed him back into his seat. Faster, faster, faster. The nose lifted and gravity released its hold. Derek's wheels left the pavement, and suddenly he was flying, climbing into a sky that had become dangerous and uncertain. Below him, the base disappeared. Around him, only blue sky and the presence of his wingman. "Shadow flight, radar contact, heading 045. Maintain current altitude, descending to 5,000 feet, came the controller's voice. Derek banked the F-16 toward the calculated intercept point. His mind compartmentalized between the technical requirements of flying a fighter jet and the larger moral question of what he would do when he found the target. Would it be a threat? Would it be innocent? Would he have to make a choice that would haunt him forever? He had no way of knowing that the answer to all of those questions waited in the sky ahead, piloted by a woman who was just as determined, just as committed, and just as unaware of the forces moving against her. The chase was on. The sky at 8,000 feet was a crystalline blue that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. Derek pushed the F-16 to Mach 0.85, just under the speed of sound, fast enough to close distance rapidly, but controlled enough to allow for precise maneuvering. Beside him, Marcus maintained perfect formation, their two jets cutting through the air like predatory birds in perfect synchronization. The landscape below was a patchwork of forest and open terrain, the Cascade Range rising to the east in jagged, snow-capped peaks that caught the morning sunlight. "Shadow flight, we're showing primary target approximately 40 miles ahead, bearing 045 at current altitude or lower," came the controller's voice. "Recommend descent to 7,000 feet for better visual acquisition." Derek acknowledged the instruction and began a gentle descent, his hands making micro-adjustments to throttle and control surfaces. The F-16 responded with the precision of a scalpel, responding to every input with perfect aerodynamic obedience. He'd flown thousands of training missions, but the weight of this one felt different, heavier, more consequential. "Visual search pattern initiated," Derek transmitted, his eyes scanning the azure expanse ahead. Somewhere out there was a Cessna 172, slow, small, fragile. The kind of aircraft that civilian pilots used to take Sunday sightseeing tour or small-town hops. In theory, spotting it should be easy. In practice, a single aircraft in the vastness of the sky was like finding a grain of sand on a beach. Minutes stretched. Derek's eyes burned from the intensity of focus as he scanned the sky ahead, to the sides, checking his altitude constantly. The heads-up display provided data, airspeed, heading, altitude, but visual contact was what mattered. Visual confirmation meant certainty. It meant knowing whether the threat was real or if this was some kind of malfunction, some bureaucratic error that had sent armed fighters scrambling across the sky for nothing. Contact, contact. Approximately 3 o'clock, slightly low, 1,000 meters out. Marcus's voice was sharp and professional, but Derek detected the underlying tension. Blue and white aircraft, single engine, matches the description. Derek's head snapped right, his eyes focusing on the point Marcus had indicated. For a moment, he saw nothing but sky and distant forest. Then his brain resolved the image, a small dot that gradually became recognizable as the Cessna. It was there. It was real. It was flying a steady heading, seemingly unaware of the two fighters closing in from its 9 o'clock position. "I have visual," Derek confirmed. "Initiating approach vector. Shadow 2, maintain formation." As they closed the distance, the true scale disparity became apparent. Derek's F-16 was 56 feet long, with a wingspan of 32 feet. It was a technological marvel, bristling with systems that cost more than entire small towns. The Cessna, by comparison, looked like a toy. Its fuselage was barely 27 feet long, its wingspan a modest 35 feet. It was the kind of aircraft that grandparents flew on their first aviation experiences, that small-town crop dusters used for their daily work. The Cessna was the kind of aircraft that wouldn't last 30 seconds in a combat scenario. Derek's throat tightened as he completed the intercept and pulled his F-16 into position off the Cessna's right wing. Close enough to see details now, the worn paint, the registration numbers clearly visible, the windows. And in the window of the cockpit he could see the pilot, a figure in the left seat, hands gripping the control yoke, completely focused on flying. Derek raised his hand in a greeting, then made a gesture pointed downward, the universal signal to land. The figure in the Cessna turned toward him, and even at this distance, Derek could read the body language: shock, alarm, confusion. The pilot's mouth moved, clearly attempting radio communication. Derek tried all civilian frequencies simultaneously, speaking with the authority and calm that his training had ingrained. "Unidentified Cessna, this is Shadow Lead, United States Air Force. You are operating in restricted military airspace without proper authorization or communication. Acknowledge this transmission. Acknowledge." Static, nothing but the background hiss of an empty channel. Derek tried again, cycling through emergency frequencies, using the distinctive call signs of military operations. "Cessna 729er, this is the United States military. Respond on this frequency immediately." Still nothing. Marcus pulled his jet closer, his voice tight in Derek's headset. "Lead, I'm not getting any response on any frequency. Could be a complete radio failure." The implications settled over Derek like a cold shadow. A radio failure combined with a transponder failure, combined with operating in restricted military airspace. That wasn't coincidence. That was a condition that suggested either technical catastrophe or deliberate intent. Either way, the protocol was the same. Assume threat, prepare for escalation. Inside the CESSNA cockpit, Sarah's hands were shaking. The F-16s had appeared so suddenly that her mind had taken several seconds to process their presence. One moment, she'd been flying peacefully through clear skies. The next, two jet fighters had manifested out of nowhere, their angular, aggressive shapes suddenly filling her peripheral vision. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," she breathed, her eyes widening as the implications crashed over her. Military jets, American military jets, intercept formation. They were trying to communicate with her and she couldn't hear them. She couldn't answer. She was flying blind without a radio and they were interpreting that as a threat. Sarah's mind raced through options, each one worse than the last. She could try to outrun them. Impossible. Her Cessna cruised at 120 knots while F-16s could fly at 10 times that speed. She could attempt to land, but there was no suitable airfield within 50 miles, and even if there was, they clearly had orders to prevent her from going anywhere. One of the pilots, the one nearest to her right wing, raised his hand and made a gesture, pointed downward. The message was unmistakable: land this aircraft immediately. Sarah shook her head vigorously, gesturing back toward her radio, trying to mime the concept of communication failure. She pointed at her radio headset, shook her head emphatically. The F-16 pilot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he banked slightly and pulled ahead, executing a turn that positioned both F-16s in front of her. One of them, she couldn't tell which, dropped a flare, a bright orange streak of light that left a marker in the sky. "They're indicating a landing direction," Sarah realized. "They want me to follow them to an airfield." But the landing direction they were indicating would take her away from the disaster zone. It would take her away from the families depending on her arrival. It would delay her mission by hours, maybe days. And once she landed at a military facility, she'd be grounded, detained, questioned. Everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd worked for would be lost. Sarah made a desperate decision. She shook her head forcefully and pointed forward toward her original heading, toward the coordinates of the flooded communities she'd been flying toward. She tried to communicate through gesture what she couldn't communicate through words. "I cannot land. I will not land. My mission is too important." The lead F-16 banked sharply and pulled up alongside her again, this time closer than before. Derek's face was visible in the cockpit, young, intense, troubled. He made the downward pointing gesture again, but this time his movements were sharper, more emphatic. An order, not a suggestion. Sarah's throat closed with emotion. They didn't understand. They thought she was a threat. They thought she was defying them out of aggression or terrorism. They had no idea that she was carrying equipment to save lives, that every minute away from her destination meant potential deaths in the communities she was racing toward. She made the most desperate decision of her life. She continued forward on her original heading, maintaining her altitude, maintaining her course. She was directly disobeying a direct order from the United States military. She was a civilian pilot in a tiny aircraft, defying fighter jets armed with weapons that could destroy her in an instant. Derek watched her shake her head, watched her point forward stubbornly, watched her refuse to comply. His jaw clenched. Protocol said to escalate. Protocol said to use force if necessary. Protocol said to protect national security by any means necessary. But as he stared at the small aircraft ahead of him, as he saw the determination radiating from that cockpit, something in Derek's understanding shifted. Only someone with an absolutely critical purpose would defy military jets. Only someone desperate would maintain course in the face of certain consequences. What kind of person would rather risk death than abandon their mission? Derek maneuvered his F-16 even closer, reducing his airspeed to match the Cessna's 120-knot cruise. This proximity was dangerous. Any miscalculation could result in a collision that would be catastrophic for both aircraft. But Derek needed to see. He needed to understand what he was dealing with. His superior optics package, designed for identifying targets at extreme range, could zoom in with photographic precision on the small aircraft ahead. He activated the targeting system, and the Cessna's details filled his heads-up display. The magnification was extraordinary. Derek could read individual rivets in the fuselage, could make out the wear patterns on the wings. But more importantly, he could see inside the aircraft. The windows of the Cessna were packed, completely filled with what appeared to be scientific equipment. Not weapons, not explosives, equipment. Derek's mind struggled to categorize what he was seeing. Metal frames held various devices, some with sensors extending outward like mechanical tentacles, others that looked like they belonged in a laboratory rather than an aircraft. Thermal imaging arrays, sensor packages, communication equipment that wasn't standard civilian-grade radio. "Shadow 2, are you seeing this?" Derek's voice was tight with confusion. "Affirmative, lead. That's not normal cargo, that's—" "I don't even know what that is," Marcus responded, his fighter's optics confirming what Derek was observing. "Those look like environmental sensors, and is that a thermal imaging system?" Derek's tactical training kicked in, analyzing, processing, categorizing. Thermal imaging systems weren't weapons, but they could be used for surveillance. However, the way they were mounted, the configuration of the sensors, it didn't match any surveillance pattern Derek had ever studied. This looked like something designed to gather data, not to spy. He adjusted the magnification further, pushing his system's capabilities to the limit. And that's when he saw it. A banner, hand-painted on the fuselage of the Cessna, just visible through the cargo windows. White letters on blue background. Derek's eyes narrowed as he read. Disaster Relief Coalition. The words hung in his consciousness like a weight. Disaster Relief Coalition. Not a known terrorist organization. Not a military threat. Derek rapidly accessing his training database, filtering through databases of known threats, suspicious organizations, potential security risks. Disaster Relief Coalition came back clean. It was a legitimate 501c3 nonprofit registered with the IRS, focused on emergency response in natural disaster scenarios. His hands tightened on the control stick. Shadow 2, I'm getting a reading on that banner. Disaster Relief Coalition. Running it through the database now, Derek transmitted, even as his mind was already several steps ahead, making connections his training had prepared him to make, but which his conscience hadn't prepared him to accept. The database response came back: legitimate nonprofit, emergency response specialists, recent authorization for disaster zone operations, no flags, no alerts, no reason to intercept. Lead, I'm zooming in on the equipment configuration, Marcus was saying, his analytical voice carrying an undertone of realization. Those thermal sensors, they're configured for subsurface detection. That's not standard surveillance equipment. That's rescue equipment. Derek's stomach tightened. Subsurface detection, for disaster response. For finding people trapped beneath rubble, trapped beneath floodwaters, people who couldn't be seen by conventional means. He was intercepting a rescue aircraft. He was intercepting a woman trying to save lives. Inside the CSSNA, Sarah could see the fighters clearly now, and their behavior had changed. They were maintaining formation, but their aggressive posture had softened slightly. The lead F-16 was pulling alongside again, but this time, instead of gesturing downward, the pilot was pointing at her fuselage, at her equipment, at the banner she'd painted weeks ago. Her heart surged with desperate hope. Were they finally understanding? Were they finally seeing that this wasn't a threat? Sarah gestured frantically at her equipment, pointing toward the thermal imaging arrays visible through her windows, hopping, praying that the pilots understood what they were looking at. She pointed toward her aircraft's interior, trying to communicate through gesture what she couldn't communicate through words. I am here to save people. I am here to help. The lead fighter's pilot looked at her directly. Even at this distance, even through the separation of two aircraft, Sarah felt the intensity of his gaze. She saw his head move, saw him turn to look at something, saw him, was it possible, nod slightly. Derek's moment of understanding. Everything crystallized in Derek's mind with the force of sudden enlightenment. The equipment wasn't for attack. It was for rescue. The pilot wasn't defying military authority out of aggression. She was defying it out of desperation to reach people who needed her help. The reason she'd gone dark on communication wasn't mechanical failure from a threat. It was mechanical failure affecting a humanitarian mission. Derek had trained for many scenarios, but he'd never trained for this one. He'd never been taught what to do when the threat was actually a hero, when the person he was ordered to stop was actually trying to save lives. He made a decision that would define his career, his honor, and his legacy. Derek's hand moved to his communications panel, opening a channel to the Military Operations Center. His voice was calm, professional, and absolutely certain. Control, Shadow Lead. We have a situation. The unidentified aircraft is not a threat. Repeat, not a threat. Civilian disaster relief mission, equipped with thermal rescue equipment. The pilot has experienced radio failure and is attempting to reach a disaster zone to conduct rescue operations. The silence from control was deafening. Then, Shadow Lead, confirm your assessment. Are you recommending we stand down? Derek looked at the Cessna ahead of him. He looked at the determined pilot visible in the cockpit. He looked at the banner painted on the fuselage that read Disaster Relief Coalition. He looked at the thermal imaging sensors that could save lives that conventional rescue operations would never find. Control, I'm recommending we do more than stand down. I'm recommending we help. Shadow Lead explained. Derek's jaw tightened. What he was about to suggest violated standard protocol, exceeded his authority, and set a precedent that the military might not appreciate. But it was the right thing to do. He'd spent his entire career training to make split-second decisions under pressure. This was the moment that separated training from truth, order from conscience, protocol from humanity. Control, this pilot is carrying disaster relief equipment worth significant value and is attempting to conduct rescue operations in an area that conventional rescue teams cannot access. She's risked her life by continuing forward despite military interception. She clearly believes her mission is worth potential death. We can intercept her and ground her, or we can do something remarkable. We can escort her to her destination and ensure she completes her mission safely. Another long silence. Then, from Major Donaldson's office, Shadow Lead, are you requesting authorization to alter your mission parameters to escort rather than intercept? Affirmative. Control. This woman is a hero, not a threat. The people in those disaster zones are counting on her. We have the capability to help, and I'm requesting permission to do exactly that. Derek held his breath. What he was requesting could have consequences. Military decisions weren't made lightly. Protocol existed for reasons, but so did conscience. Then Donaldson's voice came back, and it was steady, almost approving. Shadow Lead, you are authorized to provide escort. Coordinate with civilian air traffic control to clear airspace. And Morrison, good judgment call. That's the kind of decision that separates good pilots from great ones. Derek's relief was palpable. He transmitted to Marcus. Shadow 2, we're changing mission status. We're now providing escort instead of intercept. Clear the skis and alert all civilian traffic to reroute around our position. Then Derek made a hand signal to Sarah, a thumbs up, a gesture that meant understanding, a gesture that meant help, a gesture that said, I believe in you. Through the Cessna's window, Derek saw Sarah's hands briefly leave the control yoke, and she pressed her palms together in a prayer of gratitude. Her face, visible even at distance, showed the strain of the past 30 minutes finally breaking, tears streaming down her face as she realized she wasn't going to be stopped. 2 F-16 fighter jets and 1 Cessna 172 continued northeast together, toward the disaster zone, toward the families waiting to be rescued, toward a moment that would change all 3 pilots forever. The Coast Guard rescue helicopter had been dispatched from Pend, Oray County within minutes of Derek's status change. The aircraft, a Sikorsky MH-65 Dolphin painted in the distinctive orange and white livery of the United States Coast Guard, carried a crew of 4, pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and rescue swimmer. They'd been briefed on the situation in rapid-fire terms. A civilian aircraft on a disaster relief mission, military escort, need for communication establishment, high-priority humanitarian circumstances. Commander Lisa Reeves piloted the Dolphin with 15 years of rescue experience etched into every movement. She'd pulled people out of churning seas, out of collapsed buildings, out of circumstances where conventional rescue had failed. She recognized immediately what was happening. This was one of those rare moments where bureaucracy and human need aligned in the right direction. The military was helping instead of hindering. A civilian hero was getting support instead of opposition. Visual on all 3 aircraft, Lisa reported to air traffic control, establishing position for communication relay. The helicopter pulled ahead of the formation, dropping to an altitude roughly level with the Cessna. Through the Dolphin's windscreen, Lisa could see the small civilian aircraft clearly, and through its windows she could see the pilot. Even from this distance, even through the separation of 2 aircraft, Lisa recognized the signs. intensity, exhaustion, determination, and now, hope. Sarah saw the Coast Guard helicopter and her eyes widened with fresh urgency. A rescue organization, professionals who understood disaster response. Finally, someone who could help her communicate. Lisa's voice came through on the emergency frequency, crisp and professional. Cessna aircraft, this is Coast Guard rescue helicopter. We are establishing visual communication relay. If you can read this transmission, rock your wings. Sarah immediately banked the Cessna 10 degrees left, then back to center, the universal signal for affirmation. The wings rocked. Cessna, we understand you are on a disaster relief mission and have experienced radio failure. We are going to establish visual communication. I will display messages in the helicopter window. You respond with thumbs up for affirmative, thumbs down for negative, or use hand signals as needed. Do you understand? Sarah gave another wing rock, then extended her thumb upward through the cockpit window. Derek watched from his position alongside the Cessna, understanding that this was the crucial moment. The pilot's intentions would either be confirmed or called into question. He found himself holding his breath, hoping that whatever emerged from this communication confirmed his decision to help rather than stop her. Inside the Dolphin, the flight engineer was already preparing large laminated message boards, white poster boards with black letters that could be held up to the window and clearly read from outside. He began with the most critical question. Confirm, your mission is disaster relief. Sarah nodded vigorously and pointed downward toward her cargo hold, clearly indicating the equipment below. The flight engineer displayed the next question. Where are you attempting to reach? Sarah fumbled for her tablet, which was mounted on her instrument panel. She raised it toward the window and turned the screen so the Coast Guard crew could see the coordinates. The latitude and longitude of 3 disaster zones, a region devastated by flash flooding, a remote area cut off from conventional rescue access, a place where families were stranded in locations no rescue team could reach by land. Derek's heart tightened as he saw the coordinates. He knew that region, remote, mountainous, prone to extreme weather events. During the past 2 weeks, unprecedented rainfall had transformed that area into a disaster zone. Communities had been cut off, people were stranded, and conventional rescue operations were stalled because there was no way to access them. No roads, no bridges, no conventional pathways. Until Sarah, the flight engineer, displayed another message. What is your equipment for? Sarah pointed at her equipment frantically, making thermal imaging gestures with her hands, trying to convey the concept visually. She held her tablet higher, showing technical specifications, sensor arrays, thermal detection protocols, subsurface identification capabilities. Inside the helicopter, the flight engineer's eyes widened. He recognized what he was looking at. That was professional-grade disaster response equipment. That was the kind of technology that could locate survivors in ways traditional rescue operations couldn't match. The next message appeared. How many lives are you trying to save? Sarah's hands shook as she held up her tablet. The document displayed showed preliminary estimates based on satellite imagery, pre-disaster census data, and known population centers in the disaster zone. The number was staggering. Over 200 people potentially stranded, of which at least 50 were unable to relocate themselves and required rescue. Derek saw the number and understood the weight of what Sarah was carrying. This wasn't a minor mission. This was potentially the difference between 50 people living and 50 people dying. This was a woman who'd risked everything, her life, her freedom, her future, because those 50 people mattered more to her than her own safety. The Coast Guard flight engineer displayed one final message. Your name. Sarah hesitated only briefly before writing on her tablet and displaying it. Sarah Mitchell. Mission: save stranded families. Lisa's voice came through the emergency frequency, directed at all aircraft in the formation. Cessna pilot Sarah Mitchell, the United States Coast Guard officially recognizes your mission as a legitimate disaster response operation. We are documenting your coordinates and will be staging rescue teams in advance of your arrival. You will not be stopping. You will not be delayed. You are cleared to proceed to your destination with full military and Coast Guard protection. Inside the Cessna, Sarah's hands came away from the control yoke and she pressed her face against the cockpit window, tears streaming down her cheeks. The relief was almost overwhelming. She wasn't going to be forced to land. She wasn't going to be detained. She was going to be allowed, encouraged, supported to complete her mission. Derek transmitted on the open channel. Sarah, Shadow Lead here. We've got you, all the way to your destination. We clear the skis. You focus on flying and getting to those people. You're not alone anymore. The emotional weight of those words hit Sarah like a physical force. You're not alone anymore. For months, she'd been fighting this battle alone, raising funds alone, building the equipment alone, planning the mission alone. And now, suddenly, she had the United States military, the United States Coast Guard, and professional rescue operations standing beside her. The formation adjusted course slightly, banking toward the northeast. 3 aircraft now flying as one unit. 2 F-16 fighters, 1 Cessna 172, and 1 Coast Guard helicopter. The disparity in their purposes, military interceptors transformed into rescue escorts, represented something profound. Something about humanity finding common ground when the stakes were clear enough, when the need was great enough, when someone's determination was desperate enough to inspire others to move heaven and earth. Thank you, Sarah's voice came through on the emergency frequency, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for helping. These people, they have families waiting, children waiting. I couldn't let them down. I couldn't abandon them. That's exactly why we're helping, Derek responded. Because people like you remind us what we're actually supposed to be protecting. Not just territory or protocol, people, real people with real needs. That's what matters. The formation continued northeast, racing against time, racing toward a moment when Sarah's equipment would be activated, when thermal sensors would scan the disaster zone, when missing families would be found, when hope would be restored to people who'd run out of it. Behind them, in military operations centers and Coast Guard coordination stations, rescue teams were being mobilized. Equipment was being staged. Helicopters were being prepped for emergency extraction missions. The entire system had shifted, redirected, repurposed, all because one woman had refused to accept that saving lives was impossible, and because one military pilot had understood that sometimes the greatest act of service is helping someone else achieve their heroic mission. The radio chatter increased exponentially as the formation changed status from intercept to escort. Air traffic control centers across 3 states were receiving priority notifications about the unusual flight corridor. Derek's F-16s were no longer fighters protecting airspace. They had become guardian angels for a humanitarian mission. All civilian traffic be advised, came the Portland Center controller's voice across multiple frequencies. We are establishing a dedicated flight corridor from current position northeast toward the Cascade disaster zone. Military escort in effect. All non-emergency aircraft in the corridor are directed to reroute immediately. This is a priority mission. Acknowledge reroute. One by one, commercial flights and general aviation aircraft transmitted their acknowledgments and began adjusting course. A regional passenger flight carrying 137 people banked west to avoid the corridor. A cargo flight heading towards Seattle adjusted its routing. Smaller aircraft that had been conducting routine operations simply departed the airspace to clear the path. Within minutes, the sky ahead of the formation had been effectively emptied of competing traffic. Derek understood the magnitude of what was happening. Every rerouted flight cost money. Every deviation from planned flight paths created scheduling complications. The FAA, military operations, and civilian aviation authorities were collectively accepting those costs, accepting the operational burden, because a woman in a small aircraft needed to reach stranded families. Shadow Flight, you are clear to proceed on direct course to destination, came the military controller's authorization. All airspace ahead is clear. You have clearance through restricted military zones. No other traffic in your path. Derek banked his F-16 slightly, settling into perfect formation alongside the Cessna. Beside him, Marcus did the same, and the Coast Guard helicopter pulled ahead, assuming a lead position. It was a formation that should never have existed, fighter jets escorting a civilian aircraft through military airspace, but it did. It was real. It was happening. Sarah sat in her Cessna's cockpit, marveling at the surreal reality surrounding her. Two F-16 fighters filled her peripheral vision, sleek, aggressive, powerful machines that under any other circumstance would represent a threat. Now they represented protection. The lead fighter's pilot raised his hand, and through the cockpit window, Sarah could see him give her another thumbs up, a gesture of encouragement, a signal that said, "We're with you." She raised her own hand and returned the gesture, her fingers trembling slightly. The emotional weight of the moment was almost too much to process. Hours ago, she'd been a civilian pilot operating in violation of military airspace. Now she was flying in protected formation, supported by the full apparatus of United States military might redirected toward humanitarian purposes. Derek checked his instruments. Fuel consumption was nominal, altitude was perfect, airspeed was controlled. The Cessna's maximum cruise speed was 120 knots, which was painfully slow for an F-16 designed to exceed Mach 2. But Derek had adjusted his aircraft to match the Cessna's pace, had intentionally limited his fighter's capabilities to stay beside a civilian aircraft. It was a profound gesture of respect. "Shadow 2, let's tighten the formation," Derek transmitted. "I want everyone on the ground to see this escort clearly. I want them to understand that this mission has institutional support." Marcus adjusted his positioning, bringing his F-16 even closer. Now the formation was unmistakable, two military fighters flying wingtip to wingtip with a civilian aircraft between them, the Coast Guard helicopter leading the way. It was a sight that violated the normal order of aviation, the powerful serving the purpose of the fragile, but it was exactly right. Ground operations. In the disaster zone itself, rescue coordinators had received Sarah's coordinates and had begun the process of establishing response staging areas. The terrain was difficult, mountainous, remote, with few conventional access points. But they had time. Sarah's arrival was imminent, and once her thermal imaging systems were activated, they would have data they desperately needed. Emergency Management Director Robert Chen stood in the Staging Area Command Center, a converted building in the closest town to the disaster zone. Around him, his team had been working around the clock, coordinating with search and rescue teams, preparing helicopters for emergency extraction, establishing supply lines for stranded communities. But they'd been operating essentially blind. They knew people were stranded, but they didn't have precise data about where, or how many, or whether they were still alive. ETA on the civilian aircraft, Robert asked his communications coordinator. 48 minutes at current speed, came the response. And we've got military confirmation that the entire flight is being escorted and protected. The FAA has cleared a direct corridor. Air traffic control is holding all other aircraft clear. Robert nodded slowly, understanding the implications. The military didn't escort civilian aircraft for minor missions. This was significant. This was the kind of action that suggested institutional recognition that something important was happening. The sky. The formation continued northeast, and as they progressed, the landscape beneath them gradually transformed. The forested areas gave way to higher elevation terrain. The Cascade Range spread out below them in jagged peaks and deep valleys. Rivers that should have been small streams were now raging torrents, their brown water churning with destructive force. In the valleys below, Sarah could see the devastation. Buildings partially collapsed, roads completely washed away, entire communities looking isolated and fragile against the landscape. Her hands tightened on the control stick. Those were the people she was going to help. Those were the families she'd sacrificed everything for. And now, with military escort, with Coast Guard coordination, with institutional support, she had the resources to actually reach them. Derek saw the same devastation below and understood it viscerally. He trained to defend against external threats, to protect American territory from hostile nations. But the threat below was different. It was nature itself. And the defense against it required not military weapons, but human compassion, technological capability, and the willingness of armed forces to redirect their purpose towards saving lives instead of taking them. Shadow flight, approaching destination airspace, the military controller announced. You are clear to proceed into the disaster zone. Rescue coordination stations are standing by. All assets are positioned for immediate response to your findings. Derek transmitted to Sarah, Pathfinder, you're about to do something remarkable. The entire system is behind you now. When you activate those sensors, we'll have eyes on people nobody else can see. You're not flying alone anymore. You're flying with the power of an entire nation's commitment to saving lives. Sarah's voice crackled back, thick with emotion. Thank you. Thank you for believing in this mission. Thank you for helping. My sister, she should have had this kind of help, but she doesn't. So I'm going to give it to these people. I'm going to find them. I'm going to save them. Derek understood in that moment that this wasn't just a mission for Sarah. It was redemption. It was closure. It was transforming personal tragedy into institutional purpose. The formation descended slightly as the disaster zone became visible ahead. The thermal imaging equipment in Sarah's Cessna hummed with readiness, sensors warming up, technology preparing to pierce through distance and darkness and destruction to locate human heat signatures, to locate the people who were waiting to be found. The symbolic moment. For the next 90 seconds as the formation approached the disaster zone, 3 aircraft flew in perfect synchronization, 2 of them representing the power of the United States military, one of them representing the determination of one woman. They were no longer separate entities with separate purposes. They were unified. They were aligned. They were a single mission: save lives. Below them, rescue teams watched the formation appear on their radar screens. 3 blips moving as one, a symbol of what was possible when military capability was directed toward humanitarian purpose, when protocol bent toward compassion, when the rules were suspended in service of something greater than the rules themselves. Derek looked at the Cessna flying alongside him, this fragile, brave, determined aircraft carrying a woman who decided that some things were worth more than her own safety. And he understood that he would remember this moment forever. This moment when he realized that the highest purpose of military power wasn't to project dominance, but to enable heroism, to protect the vulnerable, to give wings to people trying to save others. All right, Sarah, Derek transmitted one final time. Let's find those people. Let's bring them home. The thermal imaging sensors activated at 10:47 a.m. Pacific Time, and the data they transmitted was simultaneously beautiful and heartbreaking. Across Sarah's instrument panel, and transmitted to the ground stations below, a map of thermal signatures began to appear, white and red dots representing human heat against the cool blue background of the destroyed landscape. Each dot was a person. Each dot was a life. Sarah's hands trembled as she counted them. 1 signature in a partially collapsed farmhouse, 3 signatures in what appeared to be a cave system, 2 signatures sheltering beneath a bridge. The data continued to stream, painting a picture of desperation and survival. Families huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat to survive the cold nights. Children curled against parents, the elderly protected by the young. And there, In the upper left quadrant of her scan, 17 concentrated heat signatures clustered together in what appeared to be a barn structure that had partially survived the flooding. "Control, we have positive identifications," Sarah transmitted, her voice shaking. 17 confirmed survivors in a barn structure, coordinates following. Additional scattered signatures across a 5-mile radius. Minimum count, 43 confirmed heat signatures detected. Below her, in the command center, Robert Chen's team erupted into coordinated action. Helicopter rescue teams that had been standing by were immediately launched. Ground-based rescue coordinators received the precise coordinates of the largest cluster of survivors. The data that had been missing, the crucial intelligence about where people actually were, suddenly became available, transforming rescue from a blind search into a targeted operation. The rescue operations. For the next 6 hours, a coordinated series of helicopter extractions and ground-based rescues unfolded with precision that wouldn't have been possible without Sarah's data. The Coast Guard Dolphin made the first extraction, lifting 6 elderly residents from the barn structure. Military helicopters, hastily repurposed from training operations, established secondary recovery points. Ground teams, equipped with Sarah's precise coordinates, began systematic searches of remote areas that conventional methods would have missed. Derek and Marcus maintained their escort formation throughout the entire operation, their presence serving as both protection and symbol. Their F-16s represented institutional commitment, but it was Sarah's small Cessna, circling overhead and providing real-time updates, that was actually saving lives. By evening, the count had reached 47 survivors extracted. By the next morning, it was 51. Some had been found in locations so remote, so inaccessible by conventional means, that rescue teams acknowledged they would never have located them without Sarah's thermal imaging data. But the number that mattered most was 17. The 17 people in the barn structure, 3 families that had taken shelter together, a grandmother, her daughter, and 4 grandchildren, plus 6 neighbors who'd sought refuge in the same location. They emerged from that barn into the sunlight having survived what seemed unsurvivable, and the first thing the grandmother did was ask about the small aircraft overhead. "The pilot," she said to her Coast Guard rescuer. "Who was the pilot flying that plane?" "A woman named Sarah," the rescuer responded. "She came here to save you." The grandmother began to weep, not tears of despair but tears of gratitude, of miracle, of recognizing that sometimes, against impossible odds, someone cared enough to move heaven and earth. By the following afternoon, the story had broken nationally. The major networks led with it. Military jets escort civilian hero on rescue mission. Cable news ran it on continuous loops. Social media exploded with the narrative of a woman who defied military authority to save lives, and military pilots who'd recognized her heroism and provided support instead of opposition. The photograph that captured the public imagination was taken by a photographer stationed in the disaster zone. 3 aircraft in perfect formation against a blue sky, 2 F-16s bracketing a small Cessna. The image was simultaneously powerful and surreal, representing the unusual alliance that had made the rescue possible. Within 24 hours, Sarah Mitchell's name was trending on every social media platform. Within 48 hours, major news organizations were requesting interviews. Within 72 hours, she'd been offered book deals, documentary appearances, and speaking engagements. The narrative was irresistible. A woman's grief over her sister's death had transformed into a mission to save strangers. Military protocol had bent before human need. Institutional power had been redirected toward humanitarian purpose. Derek and Marcus found themselves in a different kind of spotlight, military pilots being celebrated for breaking protocol in service of a greater good. There were concerns initially about whether they'd violated regulations, but Major Donaldson's testimony before military leadership was clear. These pilots identified a humanitarian emergency and coordinated with their commanding officer to provide appropriate support. That's not a violation of protocol. That's the highest expression of military service. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the Capitol building, dressed in a suit that felt foreign after months in flight suits, receiving the Congressional Medal of Honor from the Speaker of the House. The citation read, "For extraordinary courage and commitment to saving human lives, in the face of overwhelming obstacles and institutional barriers, Sarah Mitchell exemplifies the highest ideals of American valor." In the audience sat Derek and Marcus, both dressed in dress uniforms, their own recognition pending in the form of commendations that would be formally presented the following week. They'd become uncomfortable with the attention, more focused on the mission itself than the recognition of it. But they understood something important. Their actions were establishing a precedent. They were showing that military institutions could evolve, could adapt, could recognize when protocol needed to bend. The most powerful moment came when the 17 survivors from the barn were introduced. They stood, one by one, and spoke about what rescue had meant to them. The grandmother spoke about seeing her grandchildren's futures restored. A father spoke about being able to hold his daughter again, about the moment he learned they'd been found. A child, 7 years old, simply said, "The plane lady saved us." Sarah wept as she listened. This was why. This was exactly why she'd sacrificed everything, risked everything, refused to abandon her mission. These were the people who would never have made it without her. In the months following the rescue, the Department of Defense initiated a comprehensive review of intercept protocols for civilian aircraft in emergency situations. The outcome was a new set of guidelines that required military pilots to investigate humanitarian circumstances before assuming hostile intent. It wasn't a massive overhaul. Protocol still existed for a reason. But it created space for the kind of judgment that Derek had exercised, for the possibility of compassion within military structure. The Federal Aviation Administration established new disaster relief aircraft certification procedures, designed to fast-track emergency approval for civilian aircraft carrying rescue equipment. Sarah's mission had taken 8 months to plan because of regulatory barriers. Under the new procedures, similar missions could be approved in weeks. The Coast Guard, inspired by their role in facilitating communication, established a new rapid response coordination system for civilian military rescue operations. It wasn't revolutionary. It was more about formalization of procedures that had been improvised in the field. But it meant that what had been extraordinary could become standard practice. 1 year later, Sarah stood at the rim of the Grand Canyon with her daughters, in almost exactly the same location where her sister Lisa had taken a photograph 20 years earlier. She held up her phone and took a picture, arms spread wide, embracing the landscape, embracing her life. The caption when she posted it was simple: "For Lisa, and for everyone we saved together." Derek sat in his living room with Amanda, watching a documentary about the rescue operation. When his face appeared on screen, during his testimony about the decision to escort rather than intercept, Amanda squeezed his hand. "You changed the world," she said. Derek shook his head. "Sarah changed the world, I just helped her do it." But that wasn't quite right either. They changed it together. A woman with equipment, pilots with capability, an entire system redirected toward a singular purpose: saving lives. It wasn't about individual heroism. It was about recognizing when individual heroism deserved support, when protocol should bend, when the rules existed to serve humanity rather than humanity serving the rules. The Cessna 172 that Sarah had flown that day now hung in the Smithsonian's American Heroes exhibit. Beneath it, a placard explained the mission, the rescue, the lives saved. Visitors walked past it daily, reading the story, understanding that sometimes the most powerful aircraft isn't the one with weapons and speed. Sometimes it's the small plane piloted by someone brave enough to refuse to give up. The end.